Okay, hey guys, I'm Will Tipton, and I'm here today to introduce my new Heads Up No Limit book and a video series that I'm doing with HUNCG.com to go along with it. The book is published by D&B Poker, and it's titled Expert Heads Up No Limit Hold'em, Optimal and Exploitative Strategies. So first of all, maybe a sentence or two about me. I play Heads Up Sit and Goes as Sargon 38 on Full Tilt. This is my first content for HUSNG.com, but you might recognize me as the villain from a couple of Mercenaries videos. Unfortunately, these days, I'm a full-time student in the US, so I don't really have the chance to grind like I used to. But I play a bit on Merge, and I still study the game a ton. And I'm really looking forward to the time when the powers that be get things straight and online poker comes back to the US. So in this intro video, I'm going to tell you a bit more about the book, about its contents, what makes it different than the information available elsewhere, and then I'll tell you what I have planned for the video series that's going to build on it, and it's going to give me the opportunity to show some more advanced topics and discuss some more advanced applications of the ideas. And then lastly in this intro video, I want to say a few words about game theory optimal, GTO, or Nash equilibrium play. The idea is it's a very important one, and it's really the central concept in the book and in the video series. So I want to explain right up front, what it is, where it comes from, why it's important, and why it gives us a useful framework for organizing our thought processes at the table. There's sort of a tendency these days for people to kind of disregard concepts like balance in favor of focusing on exploitative play. And there's a good reason for that. But we'll see actually that there's really no conflict between the two approaches. Balanced play actually comes out of exploitative play, and deeply thinking about the one is a great way to learn things about the other. Okay, so I really want to go ahead and introduce GTO play in this first video, which I expect to be freely available, so that it reaches as many people as possible. I think game theory and its application to poker in general is really a fascinating topic, and a good understanding of some of these fundamental theoretical ideas would really go a long way for everyone towards advancing an understanding of how to actually play the game, really for the whole poker community. Okay, so great. With that said, let me go ahead and pull up the table of contents from the book, and I'll give you guys a quick rundown. Okay, so here we are. Great, so let's get started. The first chapter, it's only a dozen pages or so, and half of that is basically just a general introduction to the game, just to make sure everyone's on the same page with respect to the rules and some basic vocabulary. If you regularly talk about poker with other people, little of that stuff should be really news to you. However, we take a first pass at some questions, some real questions, like what is a game from a game theory perspective? What is a solution to a game? What is a strategy for playing a game? What would it mean to solve poker? And if we wrote down such a solution, what would it look like? Well, visually, the best way to think about a game, or to write it down sort of rigorously, is in terms of what we'll call a decision tree. So I'm showing here just an example of that sort of thing. This is a decision tree for the simplest game you can imagine, arguably at least, the preflop shove fold game. You're probably familiar with the solution to this game too. So basically, at the beginning of the game, the small blind has a decision. He can either fold, and then we go here to the the end of the hand, or he can go all in which case the big blind has a decision to either call or fold. So then, what is a strategy for playing this game? Well, basically a strategy is just something that tells us what each player is going to do at each of his decision points. So in this game, the small blind has just one decision point, and so his strategy needs to tell us what hands he's going to fold with and what hands he's going to go all in with. And the big blind also has one decision point, so his strategy just needs to tell us when he's facing a shove, which hands he's going to fold and which hands he's going to call. Okay, great. So with that sort of basic background stuff out of the way, we start Chapter 2. The beginning of Chapter 2 presents basically what you might call the most simple rule of poker strategy. Whenever you have a decision between several options, go with the most profitable one. So that's essentially a statement of expected value and expected value calculations. So that's the first thing we talk about. I take a bit different approach to EV calculations than most people that I think will make it easier for players to use them without mistakes. But it's not that big of a deal. So from there, maximally exploitative strategies, essentially we switch immediately from thinking about the most profitable decision in a single spot, that the normal EV calculation gives you, then thinking about the most profitable way to play a game overall. That is, we ask and answer a question. If we know the villain's entire strategy for playing a game, and we've written a game out in terms of a game tree, what should our strategy be in order to make the most money possible? So there's not too much math in this section. There's just enough to essentially give you the tools you need to actually figure out the answer to that question for yourself in any given spot. The most natural thing to ask next, I think, is something like, well, what happens if both players are trying to play as profitably as possible, at the same time? And this leads to a really beautiful concept, the Nash equilibrium, which is an extremely important idea. So the rest of the chapter essentially explores the idea of Nash equilibrium play. We start to build intuition about what GTO strategies look like and understand why they're useful for making decisions at the table. We also talk about things like balance, making adjustments, inducing mistakes in opponent's play, and that sort of thing in the context of our discussion of GTO. Incidentally, all of Chapter 1 is freely available on the book's website, and there's also a number of free excerpts from Chapter 2 and Chapter 3 floating around in various places on the internet. So check those out if you're curious, or let me know if you can't find them. So next we move into Chapter 3, where we start actually solving some games. There's some simple games like Prisoner's Dilemma or the Battle of the Sexes that you may have heard of, which are traditionally the first ones discussed when you learn about game theory. But those aren't actually very useful to poker players, and in the book I only wanted to spend time analyzing situations that are actually useful. So arguably the simplest sort of useful poker games are the preflop only games. And these are pretty much what they sound like. They're games where all the action is preflop. So the simplest of these is shove fold. The next simplest might be the min raise shove game. And so we, in this chapter, take an in-depth look at the GTO strategies in these games, what they are and why. In addition to allowing us to see how the whole Nash equilibrium thing works out in the context of some real games, we'll also be able to extract some general lessons that apply to a wide variety of heads up no limit situations about things like bet sizing, card removal effects, stack leveraging. And then additionally, as you're probably aware, these simple preflop only situations are actually good models for real play, at very short stack sizes. So we also take the time to talk a lot about exploitative adjustments to opponents who are playing within these preflop only game trees, but who are using suboptimal strategies. And I tabulate I present some tables that I think are going to be useful for you at the tables to deal with those sorts of situations also. Okay, great. So chapters 4 and 5 are both pretty short, and each of them essentially introduces a tool that we'll find very useful going forward. So in chapter 4, the indifference principle basically says that, if our strategy is our most profitable one against an opponent, and we're playing a single hand in more than one way, in other words with a mixed strategy, like sometimes we're raising, sometimes we're folding, then the EVs of those two ways must be equal. So pretty straightforward, but it has some consequences that will allow us to solve certain situations a lot more easily than we were able to before. Additionally, it forms the basis for some calculations that you may have heard of that might be called something like non-auto profit calculations, which can provide some useful rules of thumb about unexploitable play if they're understood and used correctly, which they're certainly not always. And then in chapter 5, we talk about equity distributions. The big idea here is that these constructions will essentially allow us to visualize the strength of all the hands in our range at one time. So for example, we might find that in a certain spot we hold a bunch of very strong hands and a bunch of very weak ones, or we might find that our range is mostly all mediocre hands in a different situation. And so we'll see later that these sorts of considerations have a big impact on our strategies. Another interesting and especially important discussion in this chapter involves how to understand our own range. So in other words, players often have a good idea of how their hand stacks up against their opponent's range. They can estimate their own equity in a spot pretty easily. They have a lot of practice doing that. But it's often just as important, when playing against smart opponents and when trying to think about game theory optimal strategies in general, it's often just as important to know how a hand stacks up against our own range in a spot. and many players are not in the habit of thinking about this nearly as much. The last chapter, before we talk about river play, is Chapter 6, Post-Flop Concepts. This chapter essentially has three main purposes. The first is to explore, what might be called standard play in the modern games, and more than standard play, standard thought processes. To understand the thought processes of maybe sort of mid-stakes players in today's games. And there's two reasons for that. The first is that these thought processes are they're often correct. They're valuable to know about and to use to motivate our own play in a lot of situations. But also by understanding them, we can start to exploit them. And so a lot of the way we discuss these ideas is in terms of board texture, and good spots to barrel on various board textures. I have a slightly different approach to board texture than I think most people do. In particular, I really don't like the idea of wet and dry boards. I don't think those are really useful concepts. So I have a slightly more fine grain, but I think much more useful sort of way of generally talking about board textures. The second main purpose of Chapter 6 is to emphasize range-based thinking. So, as I said, we talk about barreling and talk about some sort of general situations as well as some specific hands, but we never talk about how to play one particular holding. We're always thinking about how our entire range interacts with our opponent's entire range, and how we're going to play a situation not by playing particular hands, but by essentially considering our whole range and how to split it into our various actions. The third point of this chapter is essentially to understand how later street play depends on early street play, and then also to talk about how early street play depends on later street play. So you'll see here that the next chapter is river play, and the one after that is going to be turn play, and then flop play, and then pre-flop play, and that might seem backwards to you, but I think there's a really good reason for it, at least if we're looking at things from a theoretical perspective. So for example, suppose you're on the turn and you have a decision and you want to make your most profitable choice. Well, a lot of your turn decisions are going to lead to river situations. So you really need to understand the value of having a hand on the river before you can even start to think about evaluating your turn decisions. You need to understand the value of having a hand on the turn before you can even start to think about evaluating your flop play decisions. So that's why we sort of work in a way that might seem backwards. However, it's necessary to, in order to just start out with river play, it's necessary to have some idea of, what hands people get to the river with. And so that's why, we have a discussion of how, in sort of a more general discussion of how people play early streets in this post-flop concepts chapter. So the last and by far the largest sort of full-size chapter in Volume 1 is on river play. So we start out at the beginning working over 8 hand examples, and essentially I chose examples to represent a variety of spots, a variety of board textures and stack sizes. And then we do some hand reading practice to try to figure out, what ranges people might get to the river with in these spots. So this gives us a variety of realistic equity distributions for the start of river play. So from there we essentially solve river play with these motivating examples to some degree, but also sort of in general. We solve river play and we talk about GTO and exploitative strategies using 3 approaches. The first one, and the simplest, is essentially to think about simple situations where, by and large, our range doesn't overlap very much with our opponents. So, for example, maybe one player has all the strong hands and his opponent has all the weak hands. It's super simple. Or more generally, maybe one guy is polarized and the other guy has mostly bluff catchers. Or maybe a slightly more complicated spot where the bluff catching guy is mostly bluff catching, but he can also show up occasionally with, some slow played nut trapping hands. So these are sort of simple situations whose solutions can be directly applied to the river in some cases, but also, the sort of prototypical situations which tend to show up in more complicated problems also, especially after bets and raises, because bets and raises on the river tend to polarize ranges. So, then the second way we approach river play is to look at more complicated situations where the players' ranges overlap a lot. So maybe like in the very extreme case, they actually start river play with the same hand ranges. That's sort of rarely the case. But basically, both players can have a wide variety of hands, and we focus on talking about how they should split their ranges, into different action regions where they take different actions with different parts of their distributions. And we also focus on how the different equity distributions can affect proper play in these situations. So at this point, I also take the opportunity to hit on a few important topics that I think are especially interesting. Evaluating sort of close decisions, so thin value betting decisions, which are different for the small blind and the big blind, how to evaluate bluff catching type situations, and also something I try to focus on a lot is proper bet sizing and how your entire hand range motivates what bet sizing you should use. In particular, a couple of things I think are really interesting are donk betting on the river and block betting on the river. It may come as a surprise to some people that both of these things are almost certainly part of game theory optimal river play, and they can totally be used exploitatively as well. And then finally, in this chapter at the end, we return to the hand examples that we set up at the beginning, and we discuss their solutions. So we might take a stab at some of these using the analytical tools that we learned and developed over the course of the chapter, but we also solve all of these using a computational game theory code to find the actual Nash equilibriums for all of these river situations, given the starting distributions we came up with earlier. Right. So there's a lot of interesting lessons that we're able to learn there. And again, we're not focusing just on game theory optimal play in all of these examples, but also on exploitative play, which is of course what poker is really all about. So we're not just thinking about how people should play optimally, but also how we can recognize what our opponents are doing wrong and then adjust to them. Great. And then finally, here I have something of an epilogue, which just gives some closing thoughts on the game, sort of how to implement some of these ideas in practice and how to approach the game more generally. Great. So that about wraps it up for the contents of the book. I really think it contains a lot of information that isn't really available anywhere else as far as a poker player friendly introduction to game theory. That actually describes how it applies to your at the table decision making and can give you the tools to figure out some situations on your own. It's worth mentioning also here, in the summary I've sort of focused on mathy topics, which I think are a lot of what makes the book special. The approach to breaking down the games to its bare bone essentials, and then solving it to get useful results and whatnot. But it's worth mentioning that it's not a math book. It's a book about how to play heads up no limit hold'em as profitably as possible. And with that in mind, I've tried to include lots of tips and tricks as far as hand reading, exploiting particular opponents' tendencies in a ton of different spots. Lots of advice for what sorts of opponent frequencies you should be looking out for. Because it's one thing to say that if we know our opponent's strategy is one thing, we can exploit it some particular way. But it's a completely different thing to ask, how will you figure out what your opponent's strategy actually is? If you're doing something, we can say, this action is exploitable, but what will you actually notice at the table if your opponent is exploiting it? What will he be doing to clue you into that? Okay, so I try to address all of these things whenever I have an opportunity. I've just sort of focused on the game theory stuff today since I think that's what makes the book unique. There's pretty decent information out there as far as ad hoc exploitative play, but there isn't really much on applied theory. Okay, great. So now let me tell you a bit about the topics I have planned for the video series. I'm really looking forward to the opportunity to hit on some more in-depth topics, some more advanced issues for the more advanced audience here at HUSNG.com. Okay guys, so here's the list of videos I have prepared. It totals a bit over 6 hours of content, including this intro video. So the idea here is that each video gives you guys a description and a tutorial on either some tool or some concept that I think you can use to improve your games. And I think that every video here, for at least for some people, will be eye-opening to the point that it really influences how you play. So let me just give a quick rundown of each video and what you'll learn. So after the introduction, which is this video you're watching now, we get to solving simple situations with Gambit, simple river situations. So Gambit is a software that lets you set up decision trees and solve for their Nash equilibrium. So I'll essentially show you how to do that and give you some ideas about how you can use this tool to solve for optimal and exploitative strategies of a variety of situations. So hopefully that'll be useful and to you guys in analyzing spots that you encounter. Decision tree based strategizing. This is actually two parts, and the first part is video commentary on play. So I have a video of myself playing a regular from couple years ago, and so it was fun to to go back over that video and see where I played well and where I didn't play well. But maybe slightly more interestingly is after I show some of the gameplay, I actually present all of the hands in terms of a decision tree. So basically, this is one big tree that shows all the lines that both players took over all of the hands that we played together, and also some additional hands that we played together that I didn't show on video. And we use that to break down each player's strategy and look for spots where we could adjust to play better in the future. So I think this way of thinking about an opponent's game is really helpful. It's a really helpful visualization tool, and it's a really helpful way to think about developing exploitative strategies. So thirdly, I talk about non-auto profit calculations and also auto profit calculations. So it's kind of an awkward name, and if you don't know quite what it means, don't worry. But these are calculations that people use to make some estimates or some predictions for what the game theory optimal frequencies will look like in various spots. And they're very useful for doing that. They are very useful for making estimates of unexploitable play. However, people often use them incorrectly, and by doing so, they get results that are complete nonsense. So I really break down, where these calculations come from and how you can, use them in their simplest form to get decent results sometimes, and how you have to extend them to, analyze more complicated situations also. So hopefully after viewing this video, you'll know how to apply these calculations to make good estimates of unexploitable frequencies in spots without going astray. Right, because doing these calculations and not understanding quite where they come from can definitely lead you, to make bad decisions. Basically, right? Incorrect theory is certainly worse than no theory at all. Next, we have chop pot situations. So one of the major assumptions I made in most of my discussion of river play in the book was that I neglected chop pot situations, and often, frequently, I also neglected card removal effects, and those two things are connected, of course. However, it turns out that in some spots, those effects are very important. If the board runs out such that large amounts of hands are chopping with one another, or anything like that, it can make a big effect on the equilibrium play. So in this fifth video, I explore those situations, and we solve some simple river games that involve spots where large amounts of the player's hands are chopping. So hopefully after watching this video, you'll have a much better idea of the frequencies and the bet sizings that you should use in these sorts of river spots. Second to last here, we have river play from the big blind with about one pot size bet left. So this is actually a really common situation that you'll find yourself in, of course. If you size your bets well on early streets, then you'll often find yourself with one bet left to go in on the river. And here I don't necessarily mean one pot size bet, I just mean one bet. There's one bet behind. So in the book we considered a slightly more complicated situation where there was often two bets left to go in. So you could bet and have the possibility of getting raised. But actually this more simpler spot is very important also, of course. So what I do here is I solve sort of the analogous 0-1 game for asymmetric distributions. And also what I do in this video is show you guys how you can use some computational tools to do this sort of thing for yourself, and give you some ideas about how you can look at real hands, make estimates of the optimal and exploitative strategies in real hands using these techniques. One of the techniques here I think people will find particularly interesting is the use of EV distributions to look at the value of all of your hands on the river, to look at the value of all the different options you could take with all of your different hands on the river. So we talked a lot about equity distributions in the book, and we talked a little bit about EV distributions in one spot. But I think that's actually a pretty useful tool that I enjoyed expanding on it in this video, because I think it's a pretty useful tool. So hopefully you guys will enjoy that also. And lastly, we have this 15-minute video here on reading your own hand. So this is sort of a mini video, and really I just wanted to leave you guys with some parting thoughts that I hoped would help you sort of tie everything together and incorporate all of these ideas into your game. And the big idea here is that when you play, you should constantly be reading your own hand, just like you're reading your opponent's hand. The idea is to remain cognizant of what hands you can actually show up with at any given point. And so I'll talk about why I think that's really important and why people don't necessarily do that like they should. Okay, great. So again, this is about 6 hours of content, and I think it'll be really valuable for you guys. I think I've really enjoyed sort of exploring a couple extra topics that I didn't really have space for in the book, and covering some of these more practical tools that you can use to actually improve your own play. So finally, I want to give you guys some real information, some real theory. I think this will set the context for my approach to the game and motivate why the information I have to share is useful better than any standard infomercial type thing could. Alright, so what I want to do is to talk about so-called game theory optimal play, also known as unexploitable or Nash equilibrium strategies. So what it is, why I think it's important that you know about it, why I think it is that modern cutting-edge strategies are best talked about in that context, and why that'll only become more true with time. Because there's a ton of misconceptions surrounding GTO and unexploitable play that really need to get cleared up before we can all move on with our lives. Alright, so the primary issue is that there's sort of a disconnect in understanding of how GTO play relates to exploitative play. Like you see people in the comments, people in the forums making comments that indicate that balance or trying to be unexploitable is part of their decision-making process. And then other people come in and say, oh, balance isn't important, just try to play as profitably as possible. And there's something to that, of course. In poker, we're always trying to play as profitably as possible. But there's a very common misunderstanding that game theory, in some sense, is uninterested in that. That is uninterested in playing as profitably as possible. That it tells us to make choices that are less profitable than other choices open to us for the sake of balance or whatever. In fact, game theory is very interested in making as much money as possible. I mean, that's what poker is all about. So I don't even know what it would mean to have some theory of playing poker that didn't arise, at least at some level, from the goal of making as much money as possible. Okay, so what is GTO play, and how does it arise out of an attempt to make as much money as possible? So basically, I think you should think about it like this. Suppose there's two players that are playing each other, and they're both really good at poker. So what I mean by really good is two things. First of all, they're good at figuring out what their opponent's strategies are. Maybe they can do it quickly, or maybe it takes a while and they have to play a lot of hands to get data or whatever. But anyway, in some amount of time, they can very accurately figure out their opponent's frequencies and ranges and so on. And secondly, once they know their opponent's strategies, they're very good at figuring out how they should play each of their individual hands against it as profitably as possible. Right, so both of these players can figure out their opponent's strategies and then the most profitable way to play against it. I should mention, by the way, that the second part of that, figuring out the most profitable way to play every individual hand once you know your opponent's strategy, is actually really easy. It's a pretty straightforward math problem. There's no creativity or guesswork involved, and that's something we'll show how to do very early on in Expert Heads Up No Limit. Okay, so we have these two really good poker players who can identify their opponent's strategies and adjust correctly. Suppose we tell them to play each other. What happens? Again, these guys don't know anything at all about game theory or whatever. They both just set out to make as much money as possible. What happens? Well, they both set out doing what we told them to do. They figure out what their opponent's doing, and then they adjust to that. What do the strategies they actually end up playing look like? What properties do these strategies have? Alright, so this gets a complete discussion in the book, and I don't want to repeat too much of that here, so I'll just jump straight to the punchline, which is that they end up playing the unexploitable GTO strategies. The definition of GTO or Nash equilibrium strategies is that it's a pair of strategies such that neither player can change the strategy and increase his overall EV. That is, they're both playing as profitably as possible against their opponent's strategy. So why is this? Why is it that they're actually going to play these strategies? Well, there's a certain EV for each player when they're both playing GTO, and if they're ever playing anything other than GTO, such that one of them has a higher EV, then that means his opponent must have a lower EV. But then the guy with the lower EV has a motivation to change his strategy. So it's only when they're both playing their GTO strategies that neither player has any incentive to adjust. So that's why that two sufficiently smart players will always end up playing GTO against each other. Alright, so the point I really wanted to make here is that there's no reason to think of GTO play as disconnected from exploitative play. And in fact, it sort of arises directly out of a battle between two smart players who are trying just to simply play as profitably as possible. There's certainly no reason to think that it necessarily tells us that we should make plays that involve doing unprofitable things for the sake of balance or whatever silliness you sometimes hear people say. And finally, I wanted to say a little bit about why we should care about this stuff in real life. Assuming we have decent game selection, we're not playing against super geniuses all the time. So why is it that I think this stuff is still really useful? And there's actually a lot of good reasons. But right now I want to focus on the fact that I think it's the best way to come to really understand the game on a deep level. We're never interested in how to play one hand. We're always interested in how to think about our whole range, our whole strategy, and the consequences that maybe one sort of adjustment might have for our overall game. We're always interested in thinking about how a villain could counter-adjust, and what we might notice if he did so. And any reason a GTO strategy is the way it is at any time is an opportunity to understand why. To understand how you could be exploited if you deviated, or conversely, why you might want to deviate to exploit an opponent. Alright, great. So if you've made it with me thus far, hopefully you have some idea what the book and the video series are all about. If there's one thing that really motivated me to write the book, was my participation in the online community. Especially since the Hyper Turbo format has become more popular, there's been much more of an appreciation for an understanding of the math underlying the game. And it's been really great to see people learn about it, and get so much better. And yet the level of understanding of a lot of theoretical topics is still quite low, even from some of the best players in the world. So what I think the poker community really as a whole really needs now is a better understanding of a lot of these ideas in order to continue to develop and talk about cutting-edge modern strategies. So I hope that I've succeeded in writing and talking about these ideas in a way that will help contribute to that. Okay, so that's all for now. Please let me know if you have any questions or comments, and good luck at the tables.